Glad we can join for this last of our Advent series, looking at some of the different Christmas stories that we've got going on in our modern world, some of the classic tales that fill our time. So today, the two most serious things that I think we have looked at, it's not It's a Wonderful Life, it's not the Christmas story or Christmas Carol. It is Rudolph and Elf, those classic stories that tell us so much about who we are. So, of course, we needed a big, strong title to talk about what happens in these stories. So, incarnational belonging. That is what we are about to look at as we delve into these classic stories. Now, raise your hand if you have seen the 1960s Rankin Bass claymation Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Nearly everyone, because that is the classic. That is the classic. And that is the story that we will be looking at today, although I will delve a little bit into the history of Rudolph, which I didn't fully know, but I will tell you what I found in the depths of Wikipedia this week. So, now, Elf is generational, I have found. So raise your hand if you've seen Elf, and no shame if you haven't. And no shame if you have, too. It's a wonderful story. Elf has become one of my favorites. So we've got 50-50. So I'm going to walk through the plots of both just so we can look at some of the points. There's a lot of connections. If you've seen Elf, you won't be surprised to know the deep connections that exist between these two stories. But I want to start somewhere else. I want to talk about this idea of myth. And this is from a theologian named Frederick Buechner, and we're going to look at another Buechner quote in just a second that kind of frames this. But I love Frederick Buechner. I use him in a lot of my sermons, I love this. So myth, he says, the raw material of a myth, like the raw material of a dream, may be something that actually happened once. But myths, like dreams, do not tell us much about that kind of actuality. The creation of Adam and Eve, the Tower of Babel, Oedipus, they do not tell us primarily about events, they tell us about ourselves. In popular usage, a myth has come to mean a story that is not true. Historically speaking, that may well be so. Humanly speaking, a myth is a story that is always true. And I just really like that. That frames a lot of the stories that we tell in the church about how we understand ourselves. But this is kind of the lens in which I have delved into Rudolph and Elf. So again, we're taking a very silly topic, but putting some rigor to it, because I think these stories that we engage with year after year, and part of why we wanted to do a series like this, is that these stories actually do tell us something about ourselves. I think part of the reason a Christmas movie becomes a classic is because it speaks to something that is transcendent. It speaks to something that is so deep about the human experience. And so Elf and Rudolph, as silly as they are, they tell us something about what it means and what the Christmas story means. So that's part of what we're getting at. So these may and well be myths, but I think they do tell us something about ourselves. And so they are true in the sense that they speak to our souls. And then to get to that even more, Frederick Buechner, this is from a lovely book. It's called A Seeker's ABC. It's called Wishful Thinking. And it's just, it's set up like a dictionary, and you go and you find the word that you want to have a definition for, and he has all of these wonderful definitions. So that was his definition of myth. This is his definition of vocation. So allow me to read this to you as well, because I think it comes into play today. Vocation comes from the Latin vocare, to call, and means the work a person is called to by God. There are all different kinds of voices calling you to do all different kinds of work. And the problem is to find out which is the voice of God rather than society, say, or the superego or self-interest. By and large, a good rule for finding out is this: the kind of work God actually calls you to is the kind of work that A, you need most to do, and B, that the world most needs to have done. If you really get a kick out of your work, you've presumably met requirement A. But if your work is writing cigarette ads, the chances are you've missed requirement B. On the other hand, if your work is being a doctor in a leper colony, you have probably met requirement B. But if most of the time you are bored and depressed by it, the chances are you have not only bypassed A, but probably aren't helping your patients much either. Neither the hair shirt nor the soft berth will do. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Let me read that again. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meets. What does that mean to folks? Let's talk about that quote just a little bit. Means nothing. All right. Well, good. We'll continue on. No, just kidding.
I can see that in vocation. In my work as a speech pathologist, I really enjoy language, and I really enjoy problem solving with people and figuring things out. And it was also it was very reciprocal. So I was very fed by it as well as people.
Do people feel like they have a good sense of vocation, even if it's not your profession? Do you feel like your vocation speaks to something about what you do in the world? What's a vocation that may or may not be your profession? Anybody have one?
Dog training.
Dog training, yeah. Deep joy for Katie Beth and a deep need for many in the world, yeah. You can come see Bella later. That'd be great. That's my dog, sorry. Yeah, there's lots of vocations, yes.
Poetry and short stories.
Oh, wonderful, yeah. Spoken like Frederick Buechner himself. He's a prolific writer, and so this idea that we can write and create, and the way that story allows us to access different parts of ourselves is really important. So that can be its own vocation. That is, maybe you are paid for it, maybe you're not, but that's such a wonderful way to think about the world. And so I hope it's not too shocking that we're going to talk about vocation as we talk about Rudolph, because that's one of the things. So we're thinking about the ways in which action and the ways in which we are called and the ways in which society receives what we are called to do. And that is the story of Rudolph. But it's the story of Christmas, because the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. And so to frame that within the idea of the incarnation is to frame that within the idea that God calls you to your work. And so the act of God coming down into the world, the act of God coming down into human form, and I don't want to spoil Noah's sermon, but we're going to talk about this a lot today if you haven't been to the 10:15. But of God coming down into the agony of our complications, that is such a powerful idea. So the Word becomes flesh and lived among us, and we have seen His glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. So those places where the world's deep gladness needs to meet our skills is, bringing about the grace and truth of God. So let's have some fun now, because I think we've set the stage enough, but we are going to look at the deep gladness of Elf, the deep gladness of Rudolph. This is Buddy the Elf, if you haven't seen it. And Hermie, of course, is such an important character in Rudolph, so we have to look at Hermie as well and his vocation. So and I was going to say, yes. So 3 or 4 weeks ago, it may have appeared that I was simply on vacation going down to Atlanta to visit family for Thanksgiving. This is not the case. Make no mistake about this. We went to do research for today, okay? The Center for Puppetry Arts in Atlanta has 2 of the iconic actual characters used in the Rankin Bass production, and so I went, and there's Harrison looking at these characters as well. So we went and we saw these, all right? And it may have appeared that this week I was not in the office because I was on retreat in New York. That is also not the case. I was in New York studying the landscape that Buddy the Elf would have gone. Here's the Empire State Building where Buddy's dad works. So we spare no expense at Christ in St. Luke's in preparing for our adult forums, and I will be charging the church for both of those trips, so thank you. Just a little history about Rudolph that I did not personally know, but it starts as a 1939 Montgomery Ward poem. It was a serialized poem that comes out. It's in the same sort of meter as The Night Before Christmas. And so it was a promotional tool. So this is part of the original artwork from the first Rudolph. It's written by a guy named Robert May. And the animation is not the word I'm looking for. The illustration is done by someone, I didn't catch their name, but it was created as this holiday poem. And so you'll read the rhyme here. It says, "Where most of reindeer noses were brownish and tiny, poor Rudolph's was red, very large and quite shiny. In daylight it dazzled, the picture that shows that. All night time it glowed like the eyes of a cat. And putting dirt on it just made it look muddy. Oh boy, was he mad when they named him Ruddy." And so there's lots in this. So you can go and find this, the Robert May poem. It still exists in print. You can also find it online if you want to go and look at the different stories. But it starts to take on a new life when Robert May goes to Montgomery Ward and says, "Can I have this?" And they're like, "Well, this is just a promotion. We don't care. This isn't a story. Like, it's the equivalent of like the Walmart Happy Ball. Like, they don't think anything of this story." And so they were like, "Yeah, you can have the rights to this. It's fine." And so Robert May's brother-in-law, whose name is Johnny Marks, is a songwriter. And so he writes this song and sells it to Gene Autry, which is where we get the famous Gene Autry Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, based off of Robert May's poem. And then, this is what happens when you live in small, places where there's lots of creatives. But Johnny Marks, oh, that's right. Let me say this. Johnny Marks is a prolific Christmas songwriter. He's also written "Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree," fantastic. "A Holly Jolly Christmas," fantastic. And then "Silver Gold." So some of those appear in the Rudolph story. So you've got a great creative there, but Johnny also lives next to a man named Arthur Rankin, who is Rankin of Rankin Bass, which is the animation studio that eventually goes on to create the 1964 movie that we all know and love so much. And so it's just like this small little world of just like, "Hey, I got this story. What do you do?" "Oh, well, I make, animation films." They'd be like, "Well, cool, let's link up." So that's really how Rudolph comes to be. It starts as a promotion, and then it just finds its way into the world, much thanks to Gene Autry and his, singing cowboy ways. So let's jump into the story a little bit. So Dasher, Dancer, Prancer and Vixen. I think Comet and Cupid and Donner and Blitzen. But do you recall the most famous reindeer of all? And that is, of course, Rudolph. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. He had a pretty shiny nose. And if you ever saw it, some would say it glows. But that's the whole premise of the story. And so in the Rankin Bass production, we get a little more context to Rudolph. So Rudolph is Donner's son. He has this shiny nose. And then Hermie the Elf is a new introduction to the Rankin Bass movie in 1964. Hermie the Elf, he doesn't want to be an elf, or he doesn't want to make toys. He is an elf. He can't change that, but he doesn't want to make toys. He wants to be a dentist. And elves have no need of dentists, according to the society in which Hermie exists. So, you know the story of Rudolph. I'm not going to say. He's made fun of severely. He's told to hide his nose. Even Santa in the Rankin Bass production comes and says, like, yeah, this is a bit too much for me, Rudolph. And so Donner puts that cap on his nose, which you hear comes from the original story. It says, it's this mud cap that goes right on, and then Rudolph starts talking like this throughout the rest of the movie. So Hermie and Rudolph decide to run away basically at the same time, and they run and they strike it out on their own. But a big storm hits, and they come across a man named Yukon Cornelius, who has struck it out in the North Pole. Yukon is such a fantastic character. The trio is then attacked by the abominable snowman. Donner, at the same time, sets out to find Rudolph, and then is quickly followed by Mrs. Donner and Clarice, who is Rudolph's love interest in the story. And then, a very important piece, Rudolph and Hermie and Yukon stumble across what is known as the Island of Misfit Toys, run by King Moonracer, who is a lion hippogriff sort of combination. It feels a lot like C.S. Lewis. He could be Aslan, he could be a Christological figure, but we're not going to get into that right now. But the Island of Misfit Toys is filled with all of these unwanted toys who have minor defects and they've been discarded or actually never even played with because they just don't work, like the squirt gun that shoots jelly, which that doesn't sound that bad. I would play with a squirt gun that shot jelly, but don't tell Harrison about that, okay? So the three ask King Moonracer to stay on the island since they are also misfits. And they are rejected because they are not toys. They don't quite meet the classification. So Moonracer requests that the toys go back to Santa and say to Santa that this island is filled with toys, and he thinks that Santa might be able to find homes for all of them. And so they strike it out again, and they get a night on the island of misfit toys. But Rudolph is still so worried about his nose that he leaves in the middle of the night and strikes it out again on his own, and he wanders, and he eventually returns to Christmastown, where he discovers that his family has been missing for close to a year. And so he then departs to go and look for them himself. Where he finds them, unfortunately, is in the cave of the abominable snowman. Rudolph attempts to rescue them, but fails. Yukon and Hermie arrive to save the day. Hermie, living into his dentist profession, removes the teeth of the abominable snowman. And then Yukon attacks the vulnerable Yeti, and they both fall off a cliff to their supposed death. And then Hermie and Rudolph and the family return to Christmastown, where Santa welcomes them and apologizes for his past treatment. Yukon and the reformed Yeti eventually return as well. But then we've added so much to the story in between, but now we're getting into the other part of the song. So then one foggy Christmas Eve, Santa came to say, so the storm sets in, and it is, of course, Rudolph that can save the day. And so Rudolph, making good on his promise to go tell Santa about King Moonracer and the misfit toys on the island, Santa goes and he picks up all of these toys and presumably finds homes for all of them throughout the world. And then Christmas is this great success thanks to Rudolph and his non-conventional nose. All right, so where do you think we see Frederick Buechner's use of vocation in the story of Rudolph? Throw out some points. We've just walked through it a little bit.
I'm sorry, what did you ask?
Say that again?
What did you ask?
Where do we see this idea of vocation in Rudolph's story? This idea of great gladness meeting the world's great need.
Well, basically, the chief elf, the foreman of the elf's workshop, finds himself with a toothache.
That's right. That's right. At the very end of the movie, Hermie is then allowed to be a dentist, and the chief elf has this toothache, and Hermie makes an appointment for him. It was funny. Someone wrote online, it was like, this is the only positive showcase of a dentist ever in the history of anything. So I don't mind the dentist, but I know that there are many that do not. So yeah, so this idea that Hermie has finally been accepted for who he is and what he has the skills to do, and then there is a great need for that as well. So this idea that actually elves probably do have teeth and probably need dental care just like the rest of us. This is a perfect example of vocation. Yeah. Yeah, Rudolph too. So Rudolph's nose, and to be clear, like these flying reindeer are meant to be the ones that are pulling Santa's sleigh. So his vocation is part of this whole canon of Christmas fodder, but he is meant to be this person. Like they even describe it in the song, like that is what the reindeer games are for. They want to go and they want to be part of Santa's sleigh. Like that is like the cream of the crop for a flying reindeer. And so Rudolph's nose then allows him to then join into this. And so his vocation is fulfilled through who he is, and he is allowed to do that. It's so funny, Frank, yeah.
I was thinking about vocation and thinking that there's a certain tantalizing, unknown, compulsive quality to it. You have to do this, and it's never fully realized. And so you keep working at it, and it keeps revealing itself, and you keep pushing.
That's right.
And so there's a tantalizing sort of, I'm not sure where I would go with that, but irresistible urge that we must do this in spite of ourselves.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely on track with that. And you've set me up for my point about both films, but I'm not going to make that point yet because we're going to examine Elf here in just a second. One last thought, yeah.
I feel like Rudolph should have demanded an explicit apology from him before agreeing to this.
Oh, I fully agree. Yes, this idea of reconciliation is a big piece of this film too, and that is not fully examined in the canon. So yes, reconciliation does not need to look like this, but there is a piece of reconciliation, and I think Santa does apologize, which is a lovely thing to say. Actually, I'm sorry. Who you are is a beautiful thing, and I should have seen that. So that's an important piece of this story as well. It's just funny to me that this movie comes out in the 1960s. It's this countercultural time in the US, but it is also, if you really think about the message of the film, it is far more progressive than I think most politics were in the 1960s. So this idea of radical exception or acceptance of people and inclusion of people for who they are it's a progressive film. So think about that next time you watch it. Let's move on, though, to Elf, which is one of my favorite Christmas movies. Elf is first written as a screenplay in 1993. It was originally written for Chris Farley and then for Jim Carrey, but it didn't get made. And it was originally a much darker film, and that's probably part of why it didn't get made. But the Jim Carrey version of Elf would have been terrifying, I think. So. The original screenplay was then reworked by the director who eventually directs this in 2003, Jon Favreau, and he's done many things since. And he wrote a much lighter version of the story and cast Will Ferrell in it. And Will Ferrell is the reason the film works. It is his full embodiment of this Buddy the Elf who is so earnest in the way that he encounters the world. And we'll tell the story because I don't think everyone has seen this, so I'll give a brief run through of everything. But Jon Favreau made it clear that like the Rankin Bass 1964 Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer was his aesthetic for the movie. So you'll see lots of crossovers, and there's lots of little Easter eggs hidden, and not even really that well hidden, but there are lots of Easter eggs that kind of tell the story of Rudolph and to give homage to this Christmas classic. So you'll see here's the head elf from Rudolph, which is largely the aesthetic that we see in the costume design for Buddy the Elf. You'll see our two snowmans. The snowman there on the left is from Elf, but you'll also see from Rudolph on the right. They're both claymation. One of the wonderful things about Elf when you do go to watch it, if you have seen it, is most of the movie is shot in forced perspective. And so there's very little CGI, and I think that's one of the things that makes it a classic, because it's going to age so well, and it continues to age very well. It's 20 years old this year, and it just doesn't look like it has aged a day, and that's because there was intentionality in making the film work. Because, I mean, part of the story, and we'll jump into that now, but Buddy the Elf is not actually an elf. He's a human. So it's very comical that there's this human-sized elf that has to embody the North Pole with all of these other elves that are much smaller. And so the forced perspective that he uses to make the film is fascinating to me. But let's talk about the plot a little bit. So Ed Asner plays Santa, and he visits an orphanage on Christmas Eve, and unbeknownst to him, an infant crawls into his sack with all of his presents. And upon returning to the North Pole, this infant crawls out of the bag, surprising all that are there. And he is eventually named Buddy because of the name on the brand label for his diapers, which were Little Buddy diapers. So he is Buddy the Elf. He's adopted by Papa Elf, who's played by Bob Newhart, and is raised as an elf, unbeknownst of his human origin. So he thinks he is an elf. But he doesn't make a good elf, because he isn't one. So he's forced into something that he is not, tries to have to embody that world, and then it kind of all falls apart, and there's wonderful scenes of him trying to make it as an elf in the North Pole. So go watch the film if you haven't. And that's really the joy of the film is Will Ferrell doing all of this stuff. But eventually Buddy overhears two other elves talking about his true origins, and he discovers that he is a human. And so Papa Elf, his adoptive father, finally comes clean and tells him everything. His mom gave him up for adoption and then later died, and his father doesn't know that he exists. So Buddy decides to visit New York, which is where his father now lives, and Santa gives him some helpful tips, including letting him know that his father is on the dreaded naughty list. So this is much to do in elf culture. So Buddy travels to New York on foot, arriving through the Lincoln Tunnel. And this first part of the film is just so good because he's trying to figure out how to live in human culture because he doesn't understand it. So it's a story of identity as well. And so I think identity comes into this notion of vocation a lot as well. He eventually shows up at the Empire State Building where his father works as a children's book publisher, and not a very good one at that. And that's part of the fun as well. The initial meeting goes horribly. He's escorted out by security, and he ends up at a store called Gimbel's, which is essentially Macy's. And he's excited to learn, after looking through Gimbel's for a long time, that Santa is in fact coming tomorrow. They think that he's an employee of the store because of the way he's dressed. He's dressed in this costume throughout the whole film. So to see Will Ferrell, this almost 7-foot man walking through the streets of New York in an elf costume is just wonderful. So they think he works there. So he shows up the next day, and this a mall Santa is there, and he's so excited to see the mall Santa, and he goes up to him, and it's clear that it's not the actual Santa because he knows the real Santa, and he starts asking him all these questions, and he's like, what song did I sing for you on your birthday? Well, happy birthday, of course. And he's like, dang it, that's right. But then he finally, he accuses him of not being the real Santa, and one of my favorite lines in any movie, and I use it all the time, but he says to Santa, "You sit on a throne of lies." And I'm not doing it justice, but this is fantastic. So he fights Santa in this fantastic scene and is kicked out of the store. He gets a restraining order. He goes to jail. His dad has to come and bail him out. And then he gets a paternity test done to prove that he's actually his son, which is important because that allows Buddy's dad, Walter, to kind of actually open up to him because he knows it's true. And so then Buddy starts to actually become human. So he feels like he's finally starting to figure out how to work in this world, except his elfish tendencies continue to bubble up in fun ways, and that's part of the joy of the film as well. So go watch it. So part of what he starts to learn, he goes on a date with Jovi, who's an employee at Gimbel's. He gets to know his family more, like his brother Michael, and he finds work in the Empire State Mailroom, which is a great scene. Yeah, and so here's the crux of the movie starts to shift when Buddy makes a naive mistake when he accuses a writer who has been brought in to write a book for his dad's company of being an elf, and they fight again, and it culminates in Walter telling that he doesn't want Buddy as part of his life. So Buddy runs out into New York and he flees. And as he's running through the city, he sees Santa's sleigh. It's Christmas Eve, by the way. He sees Santa's sleigh coming into the city, and he has lost all of his power. So Santa's sleigh runs, of course, on Christmas spirit, and when he got to New York, it all went away. And the jet engine that Papa Elf, Buddy's adoptive father, uses to keep this sled in the air has also died. So when Buddy finds Santa in Central Park, Santa is so excited, and that's when he realizes, what I need is an elf's help. And there are no elves around, it is only Buddy. And it is Buddy, the one person who has this most conflicted identity in the movie, who starts to see his true vocation. He doesn't need to be human, he doesn't need to be elf, he needs to be Buddy. And so he starts to fix the sleigh, and he eventually, the whole movie continues to culminate. They eventually get out. Walter quits his job because he's not allowed to go look for Buddy, even after he, tells him that his boss that this is a very important thing. But it's this powerful scene. And so then Walter, where are we in time? I got time. All right. Walter starts a new publishing company and tells the story of Elf as his first book. And then Buddy and Jovi get married and they return to the North Pole to visit Papa Elf. So that's the general synopsis of the film. If you've seen it, where do you think you see vocation in Buddy's story?
He really does. My interpretation is that he really does go on the North Pole as a human. That's sort of, I guess,
Yeah, I like that. So his vocation draws him to being a part of this community that has raised him and that has instilled with him of what he really is. Yeah, I like that.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
He was saying that the the sense of vocation draws Buddy back to the North Pole. Yeah, that's where his true identity is seated in the North Pole as part of the elves of Santa's workshop.
Go ahead. So in the beginning, we see the contrast of what a horrible elf he is. He's got bad toys and he keeps messing up everything. Everybody's upset with him. But when we see him in New York, there's the contrast that, well, he really does have some elf skills because he transforms Gimbals into something that no human could do. That's right. On their own.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So something is working. Something his elfish qualities are, far beyond what we could experience as humans. Yeah. So I love, and I think the thing that connects these two movies and connects Buddy and Rudolph and Hermie even is this sense that neither Rudolph nor Buddy really changed themselves. They are asked so many times over and over again to change themselves to be something that they are not. And so through their journeys of self-discovery, through going out in the world, they don't change. What happens to them is that they grow. So I love this idea of change versus growth. And then to tie that back into the incarnation and to tie that back into our own sense of vocation, to talk about what does it mean to be wonderfully and beautifully made by God for who we are, for what we have, and for the skills and joys and the things that make us who we are. What does it mean to have that within us and then to grow into that? And so that's the kind of connection piece that I see between these two stories. And I really think that that's the story of Christmas for us as well. This is a terrible photo, but this is our nativity window in the chapel. So I'll throw it here as we talk about the implications of our vocation today, especially in light of what it means to belong to Christ. So I'm wondering where's that sitting with people? This idea that change is not necessarily what we are asked to do when it comes to our God-given identities, but what does it mean to grow into our identities? What does it mean to grow into the person that God made us to be? Because I think if we really think about, Ginny.
I'm just thinking about it and how neither one of them did it alone. I think I could maybe figure out what I was really passionate about or what I thought I was good at, and if I didn't have people around me to help me go through that growth, then I would never get to it. And Elf and Buddy and Rudolph had the community around them.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think that with that, it's both. They both have people that help them grow around them, and sometimes we get that, but often we get the other side of that too, where we're hindered by the people that are around us as well. Frank.
Well, and I think it's interesting in the Greek pantheon that Hermes is the messenger from the god to the human, and he's also a trickster. So that he is the quicksilver, and he changes and brings about transformation, but is also the messenger from the divine.
That is so funny. I've not made that connection, but that makes a lot of sense. Could people hear that? Okay. AJ.
Yeah, I also think that as far as like the community helping change, also like of course like this is as far as like the second part of vocation where your service to the community means you like both the films community need to sort of catch up with it. They had to come to realize, oh, we need these people in their vocations.
That's right.
So it's like that, their circles are changed and that happens. As far as the connection to Jesus' incarnation and it's taken a while for society to catch up with that.
That's exactly right.
And I think that's what's so funny then when I examine the time and place in which the Rankin Bass movie comes out in 1964 to where we are now. Yes.
I must take mild exception with your comments about inclusivity because the 1964 Civil Rights Act
Oh,
was
absolutely.
the first major crystallization, of it. And then, of course, in the 60s, the women's movement began. And we lived.
Yeah, and those forces are at play, so don't hear me saying that the 60s was a terrible time, but like it was rough in terms of what happens right before something new comes along. But also this idea that we have grown into these narratives for so long. And so what does it mean to have a story written in the midst of that tumult that has continued to grow with us to show us that this idea of radical acceptance is not something that we can do at one time and in one place. It takes long time. It takes us the ability to grow into this, because we're in a rough time right now. We're working with the same sorts of notions of like, what does it actually mean to accept people for who they are, and to allow them to live lives that do that sense of vocation, where their deep gladness is something that is so needed in our world. We haven't lived into that, and we'll continue to work on that for sure. We've got a few more minutes. Any other comments?
I was thinking, were you getting ready to say something, Cheryl?
No, I was about to say.
So I was thinking about the community, and I was also thinking about the idea that it's really when we hit our edge that we can grow. And so when we're only supported, when we're not challenged, we don't find out who we are. And I think this idea of having an assumption of who we are because of the way we were born or the place we were born into, and then realizing that's not who I am, it's really through these challenges that we do grow, if that makes sense. So it's like the community and the environment help us to see what we're not, and then we can become more of who we are.
And that's very valid. Mentorship and support. And perhaps a lot of demographic factors. And moving to where you can succeed and develop and evolve.
That's right. And not everyone has that ability too, so supporting that. Yeah.
In my travels, trying to find churches to go to, I went to a community church, and they had a prayer. I can't exactly remember the exact wording, but basically it said, when you pray, don't pray to be what you are not, but you are to the best of your ability. And I thought that was so cool.
Yeah. Because I think that the idea of the incarnation, of God coming down to be with us, of God putting on the complications of humankind, as Noah will talk about in his sermon. There's something that challenges us in that. And so we've talked about the challenges from the external society, but what does it mean then to be challenged to growth by our nature as Christians as well? So I don't believe that God comes down so that we don't have to change. Because the world is broken and we are broken, and part of our actions in the world continue to perpetuate broken cycles. So this idea that we are wonderfully and beautifully made is still coupled with the idea that we don't always live into that beauty of our creation. And so to live into both of those is to grow and to say that I am wonderfully and beautifully made by God, and I am called to something larger and greater, and the growth of that, the growth of our calling, the growth that we are required in our baptismal covenant, for instance, is something that will be a lifetime of work for us. So I'll leave it with that, with these very silly movies. Go and watch them and get the joy out of them, because I think growth is also about joy. So enjoy the rest of your Advent season. Join us next week for Christmas, and I'll be praying for you. Thanks, everybody.